All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Lisa Versace, and I am the Programs and Engagement Manager here at the California Preservation Foundation. In case you're new to our organization, CPF is a statewide nonprofit that provides education, advocacy, and leadership to protect California's diverse cultural heritage and historic places. Our work is made possible thanks to the generous support of our members, donors, and sponsors, especially our education sponsor, Wisjani Alsner Associates. Please consider supporting CPF by becoming a member or making a donation. Members receive discounted access to all our paid webinars, the California Preservation Conference coming up next spring in Riverside, as well as our upcoming program, Doors Open California. John, do you want to let people know about Doors Open?
Sure, yeah. So Doors Open California is California Preservation Foundation's newest signature event. We opened up 75 plus locations across the state for behind the scenes access. Most of these are historic locations, designated historic locations, and they include everything from private homes to theaters to behind the scenes tours of transit stations. I encourage everybody to check it out by visiting californiapreservation.org/DOCA or DOCA, and members of CPF get a $5 discount on registration. So that's essentially it. I'm sure Eitan's going to talk a little more later about his experience with it. So that's all I'm going to say.
Great. Thanks, John. So I'm so glad everyone could join us today for this special program where we are thrilled to be joined by Etan Rosenbloom, the creator of Etan Does LA, fantastic blog and social media project exploring Los Angeles through its 600 plus sites on the National Register of Historic Places. Etan's journey has taken him all over LA County, from iconic architectural sites to hidden gems with deep cultural meaning. And today he's here to share some of his favorite places and stories that connect LA's landmarks to the broader history of California. In addition to his work as a writer and researcher, Etan balances a day job and parenting, and recently served as a juror for CPF's 2025 Preservation Design Awards, bringing his sharp eye and deep appreciation for place to one of our most important programs celebrating excellence in preservation statewide. Please join us in welcoming Etan Rosenbloom.
Well, hello, everybody. I am Etan Rosenbloom. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, John. And thank you for tuning in. So, this is actually the largest audience that I've ever spoken to. So, can you do me a favor and just put in the chat where you reside? I'm super curious. It'll be a nice little map that I can build to, show my mom. I got fans all over the state. So it is such an honor to be invited by the California Preservation Foundation to talk to y'all. I'm a huge fan of their programming, especially the annual Doors Open California that John was talking about. It's happening in September. Again, $20 gets you into a ton of historic sites that would otherwise be impossible to visit. I've seen a whole bunch of them over the last few years, including a bunch of stuff in Palos Verdes, which is slowly crumbling into the sea, sadly. So get them now while they're hot, while they're still around. I implore you sign up for this. The tickets are available now. So if we haven't interacted before or you haven't seen my stuff, I'm Etan Rosenbloom, the founder, blogger, researcher, webmaster, video editor, and everything elser behind Etan Does LA. It is my attempt to document the history of all of the Los Angeles landmarks on the National Register of Historic Places. There are 625 of these sites as of 2 Fridays ago and counting. And some are world famous, others I guarantee you've never heard of, nor should you have, really. And I've covered 262 of them so far. Every Friday, the National Park Service updates their website with new additions to the National Register. And I kind of like grit my teeth and hold my breath whenever I reload that page because every new addition in Los Angeles is fantastic for the sake of history and preservation, but also, it means I'm staying up till 2 a.m. Every night for yet another week. So, something that you should know about me is that I'm not a professional historian. I work in the music industry for my day gig. I would consider myself more a knowledgeable enthusiast about LA history And when I started, I was more enthusiastic than knowledgeable. So if you go back to my very first posts, and I recommend you don't, they basically boil down to, wow, this place is cool. Here's a fact about it. Wow. I've gotten a little bit more nuanced over time, you know. But I find that passion and curiosity have been just as important as knowledge and research skills in doing the kind of work that I do. Oftentimes, the mere fact that someone is taking an interest in a historic site is very meaningful to its steward. So many of them are not well known and not well visited. And so, if you are one of the only people that shows up on a tour during the 2 hours a month that a place is open near you, that can make a big difference. You're helping them perpetuate the memory of this place and maybe even helping document it on social media or even just talking to your friends about it. So, I guess my overall point is you don't need to know a lot to be interested in history, local history and preservation. You just need to show up and actually go see these places. So, what I'm hoping to do today is threefold. We're going to talk a little bit about the National Register of Historic Places, what it is, what makes it tick. I'm going to introduce you to 5 LA landmarks that connect to our broader California history, and also extract a couple lessons from each of them that I find interesting. And I also want to talk a bit about visiting historic places as a way into history. So, what makes a historic place-centric approach valuable, but also some of the big gaps that it reveals in how and what we consider significant. And just a heads up, there are going to be 2 pop quizzes along the way, so please put your answers in the chat. So, as a way in, I want to tell the story of how this whole project began. It was September of 2021, a year and a half into the pandemic, and I spent all that time working from home. My wife was also working remotely from home. We had a 4-year-old daughter at the time, and she was also at home with us. And I was feeling very disconnected from the city where I grew up. And so I chose to take a bike ride somewhere. And as a destination, I picked this elaborate structure that you see on the slide here. It was on the eastern edge of a cemetery in Burbank, California. It's called the Portal of the Folded Wings Shrine to Aviation. And read up on the history of it just out of curiosity, and I was just kind of blown away by how fascinating and layered this history was. It's built in 1924 as the entrance to a cemetery, but the entrance was moved to the opposite side after the Burbank Airport was built in 1930. I assume they figured that hearing a plane whirring overhead as you're trying to, like, commune with your deceased loved one isn't really the experience that anybody wants. So it was repurposed as a shrine to aviation with a lot of like pioneers of flight and stunt pilots and stuff buried there. They had memorial services there. So this one structure that's not very large and doesn't even have like complete walls. It's connected with aviation, architecture history, the development of Burbank, cemetery history, even Hollywood history. So the Italian sculptor that did all these, the Baroque ornamentation that you can see there, his name was Federico Giorgi, and he also constructed the ancient Babylon sets in D.W. Griffith's film Intolerance. Oh, and you have to mention the replica of the Columbia Space Shuttle, which was used in a sci-fi movie too. So I saw that this structure was on a list called the National Register of Historic Places. And if I had never heard of this amazing place with such a layered history after living nearly my entire life in Los Angeles, what else could be on the National Register that I needed to know about? So, in that moment, a switch was flipped in my brain, and I've spent pretty much every night and weekend researching LA history ever since. So, what is the National Register of Historic Places? It's a federal list of American buildings, sites, structures, districts, and objects that are deemed historically significant. and worthy of preservation. It was created by the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, signed into law by Lyndon B. Johnson. And it was kind of a response to an explosion of urban renewal that took place after World War II, which demolished a whole lot of historic buildings in the process all across the country. The National Register is overseen by the National Park Service, which is a division of the Department of the Interior. So on the screen, we have the Department of the Interior's interior. It's pretty nice, brass and marble and highly polished. I visited there a couple of years ago. Now on the left is the Department of the Interior's exterior. And on the right, the Department of the Interior's posterior. It's got a nice posterior. So that was the historical butt joke that I promised on Instagram and Facebook. So if that's why you're watching, you can leave now. Um, if you're wondering, by the way, yes, the Department of the Interior's headquarters in Washington is on the National Register of Historic Places. So a little preservation nepotism right there. The National Register was officially formed on October 15th, 1966, and the very first listings were automatically added from a list of places that had already been declared National Historic Landmarks. Now, you should know for the sake of this talk, National Historic Landmarks are a totally separate list from the National Register. They're even more prestigious than the National Register. There's only about 25 National Historic Landmarks in LA compared to the 625 that are on the National Register. So what you're looking at right now are the 35 California sites that were added to the National Register of Historic Places the first day that it existed, because they were grandfathered in as a list, the existing list of National Historic Landmarks. So here's our first pop quiz. Out of those 35, 4 of them were the first to be designated National Historic Landmarks before all the others. Back in 1960 is when this happened. Now, can anyone take a guess which of those 4 might have been the first 4 to be landmarked? You can tell me in the comments and I'll put the chart back up. So we'll just give it like 30 seconds, even if you have just one of them. Which were the first to be landmarked? All right. I'm seeing some good guesses. Coloma, I was just there last week. The Mission, San Diego Presidio. Okay, lots of great suggestions. So here are the answers. The Carmel Mission, the Royal Presidio Chapel in Monterey, San Diego Presidio in San Diego, and the Santa Barbara Mission. Those were the first 4 California sites to be landmarked. So what's notable about this selection? They're all related to California's Spanish colonial past. And if you look at the list as a whole, there's nothing from some of California's most populous countries, or counties, I'm sorry. There's nothing from Los Angeles. There's nothing from Orange County, Riverside County, or San Bernardino. And we'll get a little bit into the implications of that later. But first, let's talk about what being on the National Register does for you. So on the plus side, it is totally an honor. There's a lot of pride in having your property deemed a National Register site. There is also press that can be had if you care about that kind of thing. It can be a boon to tourism if the property allows visitors. Many of them do. There are also tax incentives for rehabbing a designated property. So in California, we have the Mills Act, which is basically a contract with your local government that grants a tax break for a limited time if you hit certain benchmarks in preserving the place. Now, what National Register status doesn't do, a listed property can still be altered or even demolished. So what you see here is the Walter L. Dodge House by Irving Gill, one of the most important American modernists, early part of the 20th century. This house is gorgeous. It was right up the street from the Schindler House on Kings Road in West Hollywood. It was torn down after it was landmarked. And the same goes for the Mitchell Camera Factory, also in West Hollywood, which first manufactured cameras for the film industry and then turned into a really important gay disco. That was just torn down a few years ago. Now, for some property owners, the fact that you're still allowed to make alterations and maybe even demolish it is actually a feature, not a bug. That's something that they want. It's your property. You want to be able to make the changes that you want. So another thing that National Register status doesn't get you is a plaque. You have to pay for the plaque yourself. And when there's no oversight, plaques can be wrong. So the one that you're looking at for a Victorian house, it misspells Queen Anne. There should be an E after the Anne. Not a big deal. But it also claims that Joseph Cather Newsom is the architect of this building. And we don't have any confirmation that that's true. It's just a conjecture. On this one, the plaques actually misstate its designation. The Wilshire Ebell Theater and the Ebell of LA building, they are on the National Register, but they are not National Historic Landmarks. So they actually have two, and I've read even three plaques that make this same mistake. That said, the Ebell is a beautiful building. The Ebell is a crucially important organization in the history of women and women's education. And this building is part of the Doors Open event happening in September in Los Angeles. So I urge you to check it out. My project is focused on Los Angeles, but you're joining me from all across California. So I want to talk about some LA spots that have impacted California history more broadly. We're going to go chronological with these ones and sort of extract some lessons, things that we can learn from each of these sites. Number one, the Saddlerock Pictograph site in the hills above Malibu. So this is on a private ranch called Saddlerock Ranch, and it's covered in vineyards for the Malibu wine brand. Really beautiful grounds. They have animals, including three llamas named Barack O. Llama, Kendrick Llama, and Llama Del Rey. I kid you not. In the middle of it all, there's a former settlement for the Chumash people called the Saddlerock Ranch Pictograph site. Now, the coolest part of this whole settlement is the Cave of the Four Horsemen. It's a rock shelter that contains around 100 paintings of both figures and abstract symbols called pictographs. And among them are these four images that you're looking at right now of humans on horseback. Now, the Chumash had never seen horses before the Spanish arrived, so the prevailing interpretation is that these four pictographs represent the exploration party of Gaspar de Portola, the Spaniard who journeyed through the area in 1769 to 70 to establish an outpost at Monterey Bay. So this is really foundational stuff for California history. And if that's accurate, then this rock art is a link between California's prehistory and its modern history. So what lessons can we take from this? First, this is a rare example of early LA history, early California history, documented by indigenous people, not by the colonizers. So even though the Chumash didn't have a written system of language, they recorded this historic event in a way that was meaningful to them. And it's a reminder that LA history didn't begin with the Spanish. Now, this site also raises some questions about ownership and access. This has been owned by one family, the Semlers, since the 1970s, and they do allow public access to it, but you have to pay something like 45 bucks to take a tour that stops at the Cave of the Four Horsemen on the way. Now, should this be public land? The feds have tried to turn it into a park and purchase it from the Semlers, but it didn't happen. the Semlers have kept it safe and protected, which might not be a foregone conclusion if it was publicly owned. But I think you can also ask the question, why aren't the Chumash involved with this site, with stewardship of this site? There is a growing land back movement to try and return land and sacred spaces to our indigenous neighbors. And I'm not advocating, for one viewpoint or another for this particular site, but it's a conversation that's worth having for sure. Now, this is also an example of what happens when a property owner vetoes a historic designation. So the ranch's owner, Ronnie Semler, had gotten into a lot of clashes with the feds. First, when they unsuccessfully tried to buy the land from him in the late 70s, turned into a park. And then Ronnie Semler went to federal prison in the late 80s for allegedly exporting helicopters to North Korea. He was in the import-export trade. So when there was a push to add this site as a National Historic Landmark, Ronnie was like, "Nope, no way in hell." And he wrote a nasty letter about his interactions with the feds. That is one of the sassier things I've read through in my research. It's really pretty amazing. And so to this day, this site is listed as eligible for a National Historic Landmark ship, but it isn't actually designated as one. Okay, let's move on to the second site, Campo de Cahuenga in Studio City. I would imagine that a lot of you have been to Universal Studios before. But right across from Universal Studios is a much less expensive attraction to visit. It's in a little pocket park, and it's a vitally important spot for California history. So uh, it was in an adobe that used to be here that General Andres Pico, Lieutenant Colonel John C. Fremont signed the Treaty of Cahuenga on January 13th, 1847. This was the treaty that ended the hostilities in the Mexican-American War and set the stage for the entire Southwest to become part of the US the following year. And it was important before and after the war as well. So it was a stop on the Camino Real, the Royal Road that connected the missions up and down the coast. It was a stop on the Butterfield stagecoach route, which would take passengers and mail from LA to San Francisco and back. The original adobe where the treaty was signed was demolished in 1900, and what we see now is a reconstruction from 1950 based on an excavation done by a group of high school students back in 1931. And it turns out they got a lot of stuff wrong. So the original adobe was bigger and it was oriented at a different angle. And they only figured that out when the MTA, which is LA's transit authority, was digging trenches along Linkershim, right alongside the site, in the 1990s while building a subway stop. They ran into all these old foundations and Native American pottery. And they decided that the best way to preserve the old ruins was to cover them back up. So the foundations you see at the site today are imitation ruins. They're made out of similar stuff as the original. And there's a museum on site that has some of the excavated tile and brick on display. There's a flagpole with pieces of it embedded in the concrete. So the lessons I take from Campo de Cahuenga are first the important roles that normal community members have in preserving places. So it was a class of high school students that did the initial archaeological dig. And there was one woman, ASC Forbes, uh, who brought a lot of this place's history to light through her own intervention. So she tracked down the original treaty at the Bancroft Library in Berkeley. It had been lost for decades. And she also persuaded the city to have the Campo designated as a historic park. And they did. ASC Forbes, by the way, owned the foundry that created the mission bills that you'll see up and down the 101. The other thing that I think is interesting about this one is that the perceived significance of a place can change over time. So they tried landmarking this one, getting it on the National Register in the 1970s, and it didn't stick due to the total lack of material integrity of the site. none of the construction remained from the original adobe. Makes sense. But in the 1990s, when the MTA was doing all that digging, they realized that the ruins they uncovered had a lot to tell us about what happened there. And a site's potential for telling us about our history is one criteria for National Register inclusion. Okay, here's the second and final pop quiz. What was the name of the high school whose students performed the excavation of Campo de Cahuenga in 1931? And hint, it's named after someone relevant to this story. So some of my Los Angelinos might know. Okay, I'm seeing a bunch of Pico answers. That's a great guess. It is not correct though. Doop-a-doop-a-doo. Yeah, I'm seeing some Fremonts. That's exactly it. It was the John C. Fremont High School. And that's the man himself over on the left. Pico Oil Well number 4 in Newhall. This was one of the first two LA sites added to the National Register of Historic Places that had not been grandfathered in. It was back in November of 1966, about a month after the program started. So this rusty pipe that you see on the left is all that's left of Pico number 4. It was the first commercially successful oil well in California. Now, after oil was discovered in Titusville, Pennsylvania in 1859, speculators turned to the fields of California for drilling. And we had a mini black gold rush here in the 1860s. As with a whole lot of important sites, there is like a perhaps fanciful origin story behind this one. So there was a Mexican hunter named Ramon Perea, and supposedly he was tracking a wounded deer in Pico Canyon in 1865 when he sees this greenish oil slick on top of a spring and puts some of it in his canteen. So he takes it back to a local doctor, this Croatian expat named Vincent Gelsich, who was married into the famous Pico family. And Gelsich recognizes it as petroleum, forms a company to stake a claim, and starts telling a bunch of venture capitalists in LA and San Francisco about what he found. Now, despite some early promise from small seepages, none of the claims resulted in major fines until the mid 1870s, when a few veterans of the Pennsylvania oil fields gave it a go. So they formed the Star Oil Works to investigate. And they hired a guy named Charles Mentry to start drilling in 1875, beginning with Pico number 1. The following year, Mentry digs Pico number 4. And 4 months later, he hits his gusher. So this is a classic fountain of oil spouting out of a 65-foot derrick, pumping out 70 barrels of oil a day. So they built a new refinery just to serve this oil well, um, right on the new Southern Pacific that had just been created, like a line between San Francisco and LA. And Pico number 4 set off another California oil boom in the late 1800s. So drillers find oil beneath downtown LA in 1890, in Kern River in 1899, and Long Beach in the 1920s. And for the first few decades of the 20th century, California and Oklahoma are regularly vying for the status of the number one oil producing state in the US. And it all started right here. Now, as for Pico number 4, the Star Oil Works was bought by Standard Oil, which later becomes Chevron in the 1970s. And this little well keeps pumping out small bits of oil until it's finally capped in 1990, 114 years of service. So the picture you're looking at here is from 1957. It's a lot smaller than it used to be, but you can already see that there's a plaque in the background acknowledging its importance. So these days, the well itself is just some pipes and plaques. You can visit it, and on the way, you pass by this little ghost town that's called Mentryville, which used to support all the oil workers. Now it's basically a movie set. So, um, what can we draw from this? The importance of speculation to California's history, first of all. So back in the mid 19th century to early 20th century, California was just a land of speculation. Ranching, farming, real estate, gold, citrus, on through the early Hollywood. All of these industries were built on the hopes of something happening, something working out, and boosters trying to lure people in. It's also kind of remarkable to me how huge an impact oil has had on our historic places. So we got stuff like Pico number 4 and the Pioneer Refinery that are related to the oil industry itself. Lots of buildings that housed uh, Superior Oil and the General Petroleum Company that are on the National Register. Probably my favorite building that I never got to see was the Richfield Oil Tower in downtown LA. This gorgeous Art Deco masterpiece with a giant tower that looked like an oil derrick with the name Richfield. It was demolished in the late 60s, but it was covered in black tiles, and it just takes my breath away every time I look at an old photo. There are also houses that are related to major oil players. So the Greystone Mansion in Beverly Hills, that was funded by Edward Doheny, who was the guy that basically found oil underneath Los Angeles. Rancho Los Alamitos in Long Beach, that was the Bixby's property, and they oil was discovered there. They started selling off interest. And also the home of Upton Sinclair, who wrote The Jungle and, was ran for governor a bunch of times. He was an labor activist, but he also wrote a book called Oil that inspired the movie There Will Be Blood, which was partially shot at the Greystone Mansion. So nice, oily full circle movement there. Number 4, the Lasky-DeMille barn. So this is in a parking lot across the street from the Hollywood Bowl, and it's the earliest surviving structure from the beginning of the film industry in Hollywood. This barn housed the offices of Jesse Lasky and Cecil B. DeMille, the producer and director of the very first full-length feature film in Hollywood. They'd both go on to be major players in the film biz. But this building wasn't always a film studio, and in fact, it wasn't always where it is now. So you got to go back to the beginning of Hollywood to get the full history. In the late 1800s, the land where the barn was built was known as Cahuenga Valley, and it was owned by Harvey and Daida Wilcox, two wealthy Kansans who had come out here in 1886, bought 120 acres of land, and started attracting really interesting people to their new community. Fun fact, Hollywood was originally a teetotaling colony, no alcohol. It was a bunch of very devout people, at least that's what their hopes for it were. Um, so in 1901, this guy, Colonel Robert Northam, who's a gentleman farmer, buys a plot of land from the Wilcoxes and builds this barn just east of Vine Street, right around Selma. So here comes the film stuff. In the fall of 1912, filmmaker Harry Revier and his partner L.L. Burns leased the barn, and then they sublease it the following year to Jesse Lasky and Cecil B. DeMille, who rented out for the Lasky Feature Play Company. Now, Lasky and DeMille's first production was The Squaw Man from 1914. It's considered the first full-length picture shot in Hollywood, and it was a big success, made back 10 times its budget. And what you're looking at right now at the bottom of the screen is a panoramic shot from one of the film days for The Squaw Man. Uh, Cecil B. DeMille is kind of center right. He's wearing like a tan suit and jodhpurs. That was his favorite outfit. And if you go to Cecil B. DeMille's website, there's an interactive version of this where you can hover over any of the people in the shot and it'll tell you who they were. Pretty incredible. So the Lasky Company merges with famous players and Paramount Pictures. By 1926, Paramount builds a new facility on Melrose and they bring the barn with them, put it on the corner of their lot. Now, the barn goes through a lot of different uses when it's moved to Paramount. So, up on the left, that's Charlton Heston using the gym, which was housed in the barn for a while. It was a club room for Paramount employees. Then it became part of their permanent Western set. So you could see it show up in Bonanza, the TV show, for like 14 years. But in 1979, Paramount donates the barn to the community. For a couple years, it's sitting in the parking lot outside the Capitol building. That's the picture over on the right of the screen. And then in the mid 80s, it's moved to the parking lot where it is today. And Hollywood Heritage takes ownership of it, rehabs it, turns it into a museum. I see a couple people commenting, join Hollywood Heritage when you visit. Absolutely. It's a really great organization. And the museum that they created is a marvelous little thing full of props and memorabilia from all different ages of Hollywood history. And they preserved Cecil B. DeMille's office there with a lot of the original details. One of my favorites is they kept the trash can underneath his desk where he would put his feet up while caretakers were like hosing down the floor. Because like when he first started working there, it was still a barn. Probably smelled of horse stuff. So, what are the lessons we can take from the Lasky-DeMille barn? One, this is a great example of adaptive reuse. And if you haven't heard of this concept, it's kind of one of the signature moves in preservation. It's the idea of taking something that had one use initially and rehabilitating it or transforming it so that you can use it for something else while still preserving a lot of the original features. It's a great way of adding to a building's history while preserving what makes it unique. And it's also a lot more environmentally friendly than demolishing something and building something new. The other thing to learn from this is the history of moving buildings. So this barn moved at least 4 times in its history. And that process was actually a lot more common than you'd think around the turn of the 20th century. Literally right now, as we're talking, the Los Angeles Conservancy is hosting a webinar about relocating 2 threatened houses from Hollywood and Los Feliz over to Altadena to help rebuild after the recent fire. If I wasn't talking to you right now on this webinar, I would absolutely be watching that one. So thanks for being here. Okay, and here's the last of the 5 houses or 5 buildings we're going to talk about today. Now, unless you've never seen a movie or read a magazine or flipped through a coffee table book, you will know this photo on the right by the great architectural photographer Julius Schulman. This is the Stahl House in the Hollywood Hills. It's one of the best known examples of mid-century modern housing in America. And it's deceptively simple. It's an L-shape, floor-to-ceiling glass on almost every side, big overhang to protect it from the sun, and it's all wrapped around a pool and oriented towards that magnificent view. That's it. The story of this house is just amazing. So Buck and Carlotta Stahl were newlyweds in 1954, living down at the bottom of Laurel Canyon, not far away from the Stahl house. And they kept eyeing this dirt patch at this tall outcropping right across the canyon from where they lived. One day, they drive up to check out their lot, and the landowner happens to be driving up around the same time. So they meet him, and they hash out a $13,500 mortgage. They had to wait for 4 years until the mortgage was paid off in order to start building. But in the meantime, they drive around town in their convertible and they rescue leftover bits of concrete from various construction sites. Buck uses all those scraps to expand the footprint where they're going to build and create terraces. He also designs a model of what he wants the house to look like. And it's pretty wild for the mid 50s. It's got this long cantilevered living room that kind of juts out over the side, and even a waterfall that cascades down the hill. Now, they were trying to find an architect once they paid off their mortgage, but nobody wanted to work with them until they find this young dude named Pierre Koenig. Now, Koenig was deep into the idea of using industrial materials in residential contexts. He built his own house out of steel beams and a corrugated metal roof while he was still in architecture school at USC. And Koenig brought that approach to the Stahl house. So the nice thing about industrial materials is that they're cheap and often prefabricated. So you could put up a house for little money and really quickly. The steel frame for the Stahl house went up in a single day. That wigs me out. There is a philosophy at work here that good design can and should be accessible to everybody. And that idea aligned Koenig's work with the Case Study House program. Now, if you've never heard of this program, uh, if you ever meet an architect and want to win their favor, just talk about the Case Study House program. It sends us swooning, us architecture fans. It was a program run by Arts and Architecture magazine starting in 1945 that commissioned architects to design innovative single-family homes that could serve as models for like mass-produced housing of the future. The case study house architects got discounted rates on the latest building materials. Um, Material suppliers got publicity in the magazine, and the public was allowed to stop by and tour each of the case study house program houses before the new owners moved in. So everybody wins. And the Stahl house became case study house number 22. It was actually Koenig's second home in the program. Now, in a lot of ways, the case study house program didn't achieve its goals. Not enough people were interested in living in something this stark and new. It could be difficult to get home loans for something this modern. Um, but the program defined a lot of the basic tenets of mid-century modernism throughout California. Things like open plan living rooms, and floor-to-ceiling windows, horizontality, um, and all kinds of stuff. Playing with textures and playing with the connection between the indoors and outdoors that you could really only get in California with weather this mild. And the program continues to inspire architects and interior designers around the world. So the couple lessons that I wanted to talk about regarding the Stahl House, first is that good design isn't limited to people who can afford it. At least it wasn't back then. So Buck and Carlotta Stahl were solidly middle class. He was a salesman at an aerospace company. She was a receptionist before she left the workforce to raise their kids. And they had money troubles. So when Buck's company folded in 1969, they had to lease out the house to other people just so they can make their mortgage. In fact, one of the people they leased it out to was the manager of the band War. You know, they did Lowrider. So they were riding high pretty then, back then. An interesting fact I came across regarding the financing for the Stahl house. The only bank that would lend the Stahls money for this was Broadway Federal, which is a black-owned bank in LA, which happened to have on its board the great Paul Revere Williams, the first licensed black architect in California, and a huge champion of modernism. So I can't imagine that that hurt to have a guy like that on the board. And another thing is that one of the conditions of the bank loan from Broadway Federal was that there had to be a pool. And the bank wasn't even willing to finance the pool at the Stahl house. So they basically paid for it out of pocket as a condition of the loan. And isn't that kind of amazing that one of the defining features of one of the world's most famous houses wasn't proposed by the owners or the architect? It was proposed by the bank that financed it. So the other lesson here is the importance of good visuals in spreading design ideas. That Schulman photo, I'll go back to it. Um, it's just one of the most famous pictures of LA ever taken, architectural or otherwise. And it earned awards for Schulman. It was published everywhere, even in the popular press. It earned renown for the house, but also income for the family. So there are tons of movies, TV shows, magazine shoots that have taken place there. And it all started with Schulman's photo from 1960. On a more global level, we're used to experiencing buildings through pictures or video. So much great architecture is private or too far away to visit, and photos are the only way that we know that they exist. if you're into this subject, there is a terrific podcast called Save As. It's run by the USC Heritage Conservation Program. They had an episode from this past April with a recent grad named Sam Malnati, whose thesis was all about photography's role in preservation. It is a fascinating listen. I suggest you check it out. Oh, that's amazing. We have the son, or yeah, the son of Rodney Walker, who designed three of the case study houses. Thank you for tuning in, Craig. Um, okay, so Etan does LA is a history project, but I'm looking at history through the prism of one physical place at a time. And if you think about the approach that we all had in high school or college survey courses, where you're introduced to a broad theme, say the California Gold Rush, and then you learn about the people and places that illustrate that theme, it's very much a top-down approach. Learning through landmarks like I do in my project is the exact opposite. So my list of places to visit is predetermined. I plugged all 625 of those spots into Google Maps, and depending on where I'm going to be that weekend, I'll just pick one nearby and learn about it, whether it fits into a theme I care about or not. So, spots I visit might be important for their architecture or how it reflects a demographic shift or someone important who lived there. I ping pong between all of those different areas of significance. And that's exhilarating. But there are definite drawbacks to this approach. So, first, learning history through landmarks means my understanding of history is defined by the sites I've visited, especially early on when I hadn't connected that many dots. So I end up with lots of blind spots and knowledge gaps. So, like, I know a decent amount about how architecture and building styles developed in LA, but I'm not as well versed on politics or the history of the entertainment business. And that kind of stuff can definitely be a deficit and an issue depending on where I'm going. I don't know all the questions that I should be asking when I visit a site. There are also instances where I'm lacking important cultural context that impacts sites today. So I'll give you an example. I posted about the original site of the Mission San Gabriel Arcangel. That was, you know, just ground zero for LA historic sites for sure. But the one you can visit right now wasn't its first location. Now, when I posted about that original site, I unknowingly stepped into an argument between representatives of two indigenous tribes in the LA basin. And it really called into question my own understanding of some fundamental things. So, like even the names that they use to refer to themselves are in conflict, and I didn't understand them properly. You also encounter a lot of gentrification conflicts when you're exploring sites that have had a long history. So the one that you're looking at on the screen right now, this is the Golden Gate Theater, an old movie theater in East Los Angeles that turned into a CVS. And when I posted about it, a woman online told me essentially not to turn it into a hipster tourist attraction, which would just end up taking resources away from the community. And other people accuse me of sending white people to East LA and asked me politely to basically go back where I came from. Now, I have issues with this rhetoric. I have issues with the arguments. But the point is that there is very real friction that often isn't addressed in the standard histories of these places. And I think it's incumbent upon anyone who's visiting a landmark to understand, or at least like be aware of its role in the community and what you might be stepping into when you visit it. So there are also some structural quirks in the landmarking process that make it more difficult to get a complete picture of why a place might be important. And one of them is the scope of National Register listings, which are sometimes strange and arbitrary seeming. The thing to understand is that there's not a governing body at the federal level who chooses them. The National Park Service says yes or no, but they're not looking at the entire landscape of potential landmarkable spots and saying, oh, we should really go for that one. Basically, a place needs a passionate ambassador at the local level, who then sends it to their state, who approves or denies it, and then the state sends it on to the National Park Service, who usually says yes. But if a place doesn't have a passionate ambassador or a reason to be nominated, it won't be nominated and it won't be landmarked. So you end up with a couple dozen branches of the Los Angeles Public Library on the National Register, including a bunch that have been abandoned for decades. But the Griffith Observatory isn't on the National Register. The LAX theme building isn't on the National Register. I mean, these are some of LA's most famous buildings. The Hollywood Bowl, the Capitol Records building, were just added in the last couple of years. The other thing is the National Register forms focus on a narrow span of time that's considered to be the historic period for a site. And that period can also seem kind of arbitrary. And it often, leaves out info about how buildings are used now, which means that we miss crucial developments that meaningfully contribute to a place's history. And it also means that later preservation history may go undocumented. Now, look, there are plenty of other sources that you could go to get the later history beyond what the National Register forms considered to be, the period of significance. But these forms are often considered sort of like the information of record as to what is historic and why. And so they have some outsized impact on our sense of the significance of a place. Now, as we saw before with that list of 35, the first 35 California sites on the National Register, the early listings in California suggested a pretty narrow and Eurocentric idea of what constitutes a significant place. It's only in the last few decades that we've seen more historic sites that are related to the experience of women, Black people, Chicanos, Asian Americans, uh, uh, Native Americans, and the LGBTQ community. And it goes beyond what sites get nominated. It's also important to examine what stories we see highlighted in the forms that are submitted. So I'll give you one example. The Bradbury Building is just an acknowledged architectural masterpiece in Los Angeles. And its nomination form talks about the architect George Wyman and Sumner Hunt and the man who commissioned it, Louis Bradbury, but it leaves out Bradbury's Mexican wife, Simona, who oversaw the building's completion after Bradbury died and then managed the family's business interests. She was also very important in this whole story. So there is some good news in this regard. There are current programs designed to change the landmark landscape. So programs like the African American Historic Places Project, which is being run by the Getty Conservation Institute and LA's Office of Historic Resources. There's the LA Women's Landmarks Project from the LA Conservancy and the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Both of those projects are trying to get more things nominated that relate to untold stories. And I've even heard about efforts at the USC Heritage Conservation Program to actually go back and change existing nomination forms to fill in some of the gaps and the stories that were left out and shouldn't have been. So I want to make clear, like, we have people from all over the political spectrum here, I'm sure. Efforts to survey and nominate new historic places, like I've outlined, I think they go beyond political correctness. These kinds of programs go to the heart of why we try to protect our built world. We don't build things just to be looked at. We build them to live in and to work in and congregate in them. I love historic architecture, but if we're only acknowledging an old building for its form or for, what it says about architectural style, and we ignore the role it played in people's lives, we're missing a crucial part of its history, maybe the crucial part of its history. So we need to work to preserve those stories too. Now, here's why learning history by visiting landmarks, I think, is so valuable. First, It requires that you experience the physicality of a place. Most of us primarily know the most famous buildings through pictures or movies, TV shows. Now we see them on social media. But your understanding and connection to a place changes when you walk around it. Like we said before, buildings are meant to be experienced. There's a spatial sense that you just can't get unless you're actually at a place, which is one of the reasons that it's such a letdown that so many of the sites I visit are just private homes that I'll never get inside. I'm shooting a video from outside a security fence or something. Um, this kind of approach forces you to learn and think about things that you were never exposed to. Architecture, social history, oil and gold, electricity, transportation, how the wars impacted California, the material records left by indigenous Americans. All of these things are represented by a historic place near you. You just have to go find it. Documentation. So this is an advantage to this process that is near and dear to my heart. I grew up in Altadena. It was one of the two communities that was destroyed by the fires earlier this year. And my parents' rental house was literally the only one on their block that survived. So it really hit home after the fires the importance of visiting and documenting our most cherished buildings while they're still around, because you just never know what's going to happen. I'm lucky that I'd visited many of the historic places in Altadena already because so many of them are gone now. And there were a couple that I never got to see. But every time you go visit a place, you take a picture of a place and put it on Instagram or just have a photo, in your Google Drive or on your phone or whatever, it means something of that place is preserved. Yes, the Will Rogers home as well. That one was also destroyed by the fire. So many incredible historic places were. I find this approach also encourages unexpected connections between disparate sites. History becomes clearer, the world gets smaller when you go to one place and the tour guide tells you, um, oh, yeah, this was Lucky Baldwin's cottage, and he made a lot of money at the Ophir mine. And then you visit Gold Country and you see the Ophir mine over there. It's really amazing to see. So my family has a tradition of stumbling upon Julia Morgan buildings. She was the architect of the Hearst Castle, who left her mark all over California. So I accidentally discovered the Church of the Chimes in Oakland when I was just down the street, and someone pointed it out to me. And I was actually reading a book about Julia Morgan in a bookstore when I found out about that. Then just last week, we were traveling through Gold Country, and I'm looking at historic stuff to do. I noticed that right outside Grass Valley uh, is Julia Morgan's first residential commission from 1904. It's the house is open for tours like 4 hours a month, and I just happened to be there at the right time. And what you're looking at right now is another Julia Morgan that I discovered when my family was driving up through Humboldt County a few months ago. It's a Hearthstone in the middle of a redwood grove. You would never run across it unless you were looking for it. Please look for it. It's a jaw-dropping thing. Okay, I'm almost done now. I know we need to get to the Q&A. So preservation. It's impossible to study historic places and not develop some kind of desire to help them survive. There is so much great work being done in the preservation field by the California Preservation Foundation, of course, but also local historical societies and conservancies and social groups throughout the state. So if you're interested in getting involved with preservation, uh, look for your local historical society. Do it on a local level. That's where you can make a big impact. And that brings me to the last advantage of this landmarks first approach, and it's community. So I've made a ton of friends who are into LA history online and in real life, all because of visiting places and sharing about it online. They all know things that I don't. We're all contributing to a giant pool of knowledge and memory that ends up helping. And if you want the knowledge that any of these people have, all you got to do is take the tour or ask a question. Just show up, go to these places. That's the best way to help preserve them right now. So speaking of question asking, I think we have time for a Q&A. I should say thanks for doing LA and California with me. And Lisa, do we have some questions?
We absolutely do. Some of them I'm going to just breeze through quickly. They came in through the Q&A and they've been answered in the Q&A, but I just want to make sure that everyone has a chance to kind of hear them. And then I'll go on to a couple for you to answer. So one was someone asked if you knew who the tile manufacturer was for the dome of the Portal of the Folded Wings Shrine. And while you were speaking, I was able to look that up. And of course, now I have moved away from that screen. And the answer to that was somewhere called Alhambra Kilns in Santa Monica. Was looking at the form from the National Register of Historic Places from 1998, which stated that the dome still had 95% of its original tiles, which I thought was fascinating.
Wow.
Another question that was answered was if you knew that Frederick Hastings Rindge was related to the Hastings of the law school. And another one of our guests who self-identified as a historian of Rindge said that she had never heard that. So assuming that is not the case.
Yeah, someone had asked if Ringe was somehow related to or had any connection to the Saddlerock Ranch. Um, I know like Ringe and his wife basically owned all of Malibu at one point, but I don't know that it extended that far. Uh, I haven't seen any documentation that said it did.
Okay.
I will say, if you visit the Malibu Wine Ranch, where that Saddlerock Pictograph site is, just down the road, just a little bit northwest, is Frank Lloyd Wright building. It's the Arch Oboler complex, and it was destroyed in the Woolsey fire a few years ago, but you can still see the ruins of it. I mean, if you're up for having a sad, it's pretty sad to see, but still kind of amazing.
A little downer part of your day. All right. So getting into some of the additional questions, towards the top of your program, someone asked, sort of broadly, wondering, maybe a rhetorical question, if some of the sites were now getting updated signs based on the new federal administration, much like John Muir National Monument has recently. I don't know that you could speak to any specifically that you know of. And from my knowledge, I would think that anything that was in a national park or in a national monument may be getting updated signs depending on what the current ones say. Certainly, as you pointed out, the brass plaques that someone may have on their National Register site are self-written and maybe not under scrutiny from the national government, but
That was my thought. I haven't come across any that, have been mandated to be changed, but the National Register listed sites are very different than what we're talking about National Park Service wise. Like the properties themselves are not owned by the government. At least most of them aren't. There are some, but I haven't visited those ones, since Trump's mandate. But the large majority of them, they're under private ownership, and so it wouldn't really impact them. I do share a lot of people's concerns, though, about what the impact could be about, those signs. So it's a
sure.
good question.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, Another guest asks, what have you found is the best medium to use to get the word out about your local historically significant places, buildings, etc.? Is it Facebook, Instagram, local organization, news, etc.?
That's a really great question, and I think it kind of depends on what you're talking about. I've found a bigger audience on Instagram than the other platforms, but um, I've also found that in terms of connecting with people that know stuff that I don't, Facebook groups are far and away the best place. So I'll give you an example. I was writing about all the National Register sites on Catalina, and there were like four of them. And I had stumbled across like this pet cemetery that they have, which is totally unsanctioned. And I didn't know the history of it. And so I was able to go to like a uh, old timers from Avalon Facebook group or something. And I found the one guy that had all the information about this and was able to like, point to the approximate year span when it would have been started up. So there's a lot of people who share stuff on Facebook that don't share anywhere else.
I was gonna say, I'm sure you've made his week too, that you were writing him to ask about
Oh yeah.
it.
Yeah. It's like he was waiting his entire life to answer this question.
And social media brought you two together. There are positives of it.
Beautiful thing.
Um, I think this will be maybe our last question. We'll see. We'll probably go to about 10 past. Someone asks if any of what you presented today discussed in public education, K-12, to get the next generation informed, educated, enthused about California history. If not, why not? And I know you are not the head of education for the state of California, but I guess I would kind of change the question and ask, do you see anything like this, in maybe your daughter's future curriculum? And if not, do you feel like as a parent, you're in a position to advocate for that? Or do you personally feel, I mean, there's so little that can be covered in the 12 years that we try to teach someone sort of everything, or 13 years we try to teach someone everything. But have you come across any of this in the public education areas?
I haven't in my own experience with like my daughter's schooling. And I know it's like curricula or curricula. There's not much room for flexibility. What I will say is the conversation I hear a lot is people my age and a little bit younger that grew up in California, uh, getting one story about the mission system and how it worked, and omitting some of the less savory stuff about it. And so once you start digging into it and visiting these places, you realize, hey, I mean, for whatever important changes they made and whatever history they set for California, there's a lot of awful stuff that happened there as well. And that isn't really talked about. And so you need to encounter that in other ways. So I would advocate for age appropriate lessons about where you're at, or like, the community that your child is in. But I haven't really seen actual, landmarks addressed, at least at my daughter's age. I mean, she's 8. Most of the education that my daughter gets about these places is gained from me dragging her to another historic site every weekend. And she actually came up with her own theme song for the National Register that I've recorded on video a few times.
You'll have to share that with us the next time. I would also add a plug. We did a program several months ago for the UCLA History Geography Project. And they, I think in the LA area in particular, do a really great job of going into schools in different communities and trying to bring that local history to that school. So I would certainly encourage looking into the work that they are doing for anyone who's interested. Um, One last question, if I might take a couple more minutes of your time. And this is my own question. I was curious, you really seem to do a deep dive, as exemplified by, I thought I knew a lot about the Stahl House, but I had no idea that Paul Revere Williams had a connection to it.
Yeah.
But you also acknowledged, I think very humbly and, very courageously that you have your own gaps in knowledge, and that no matter how hard you try, there are going to be those gaps. So I was just wondering sort of what is your approach to researching, identifying a site, and how has that evolved as you've continued to do this project?
Well, thank you for saying that, first of all. I felt like I don't think I could do this without some humility because, like, you know, I learn something from literally every place that I go, even if it's just reinforcing something that I understood already. Um, and there's always someone who works there or lives there who knows way more about a place than I do and has access to histories that you just can't find anywhere. So, as far as the researching goes, early on, I would basically do just some rather cursory Googling. It would usually start with the National Register application form. And you can find all of those at the National Park Service website. There's a database. You can search through it or download the entire thing. Um, and they have links to each of the nomination forms. And these things date back to, the 1960s. So they are of varying quality and comprehensiveness. But it's always a good place to start. I consider it sort of like the Wikipedia of my research, where it can point you in the right direction, but it's not the be all and end all of your research. They often have really good bibliographies. Um, there were a couple things that were really game changers for me in terms of my research. One of them was newspapers.com for sure. That has like licensed newspapers stretching back to, hundreds of years ago. And so you can find out info about, when something was built, who was at the opening ceremony or the ribbon cutting ceremony, how it changed use. You can even find like ads for businesses that were at a particular office building, if you're curious about that. So that's been huge. And honestly, like learning how to work with LA's building records. Like we have our Department of Building and Safety. They have an online database of all the permits that have been pulled. And so that can sometimes tell you who was the original owner who commissioned XYZ, how has it changed over time, uh, how has the building footprint changed, that kind of stuff. So you can figure out, piece together like what's original and what isn't. Um, there's a lot of photo resources out there too. I use Calisphere all the time, calisphere.org. It's basically assembles a bunch of existing databases of photos from libraries and, different museums around the state. And so you can start there as a basis for finding old photos.
Well, a huge thank you. I could chat with you all day, but I feel like at some point we probably need to let you go back to your day job.
Yeah.
Although I think that the audience would second if you ever decide that music is not your career, that we would be more than happy to have you join the field of preservation. Um, and again, a huge thank you just for sharing your journey into historic preservation with us. I think the sites that you chose were fascinating. I certainly know that I learned a lot. As I said, I had no idea that Paul Williams was connected to the Stahl House, which I just found fascinating. I really think that I am so grateful also knowing the amount of effort that you put into this presentation for us. A huge thank you to our audience for joining us. On behalf of the California Preservation Foundation, I sincerely hope you enjoyed today's program and welcome your feedback through the form you'll be redirected to. When you close your Zoom window, it lets you tell us what we did well, where we could improve, and what future programs you would like to hear from us. Excuse me. We have another program coming up in a couple of weeks featuring author Alan Hess and contributor Christine Madrid-French discussing the book The Palm Springs School, Desert Modernism, 1934 to 1975. That'll come up on Thursday, August 12th. Please join us for that program. And finally, again, if you are not already a member, please consider supporting us either by becoming a member or making a donation. And as a reminder, members do get discounted access to our paid programs, the California Preservation Conference, as well as Doors Open, which will be starting in September. Again, a huge thank you to Etan, just an amazing presentation. And I hope everyone has a great afternoon and we see you all soon.
Thanks, everybody.